So let me start with, though I said I wasn't going to get academic, let me just start with a definition for nature journaling, because this is very pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about in terms of my own story as a nature journaler, which is a hard word for me to say. So this definition in its long form says this: nature journaling is the practice of drawing or writing in response to nature. This fun, relaxing practice helps a person to connect more closely with nature and results in the creation of a unique nature journal. So the idea is several-fold here. First of all, it is having at its center this engagement with the natural world or observation of the natural world. And then there's the piece of the person who is having that engagement creatively recording that in some fashion through image or through word. And then the final piece is this outcome that you have, a person has a nature journal. What I realized as I looked quickly to just see what definitions there were for nature journaling, and this is sort of the basic, this is a little bit of a composite of many different people's ideas about what nature journaling is. But what's so interesting to me is that there are all these pieces, like, so basically a nature journal, as long as it revolves around nature, can kind of be anything. And it can include art, right? So the creation of things, sketches or paintings, photographs in my case. It might be very sciencey and quantitative. And I know people who keep a little bit like field logs, and we know some famous explorers from the past and also naturalists who have kept nature journals of various sorts, some more like a travel log, some more like a recording of scientific facts of flora and fauna in various biomes, others who just wrote anecdotes about what was unfolding on the land or made stories or were creatively inspired. So if you think about people like Darwin or even the Shackleton voyagers, there are a lot of accounts of those various journeys that were all about the natural world and engagement, and also, of course, Thoreau in his experience living at Walden. All of those things that they created, those bodies of work that we now read, are, in my opinion, nature journals of various sorts. So nature journals might include our feelings about what we're seeing or experiencing. They might include sensory bits. And when I say sensory, I don't just mean what we're seeing or how cold or hot it is in the natural environment in which we're present. But I also mean, are we tasting what's happening in the moment? Are we really present in kind of an intuitive way? So there are all of these senses. Are we actually touching what we're seeing, or are we solely looking at the landscape and the creatures and engaging in that way and then recording what we see? Art is huge in nature journals. And I will admit this, for many, many years, did not realize, admit, or tell anyone that I was a nature journaling person, because I had this idea that in order to do a nature journal, you had to make this incredible product that had exquisite paintings with all the correct colors of the birds drawn with exact proportion, so that you could look at this bird, and if you knew what a chickadee looked like, you could look at this drawing in this person's nature journal and say, yes, aha, you saw a chickadee on the 11th of May 2021 in your backyard. But lo and behold, I have been journaling about nature for as long as I can remember. So in that way, is journaling about nature the same as nature journaling? I kind of think it is. And in my case, it is, because I've gotten intimate with the creatures around me. A bird as simple as a junco, which is a small little bird I've actually had the fortune or misfortune of holding a deceased junco in my hands from time to time, in order to move them to a place where I might bury them and honor their life with a few flowers. I actually happen to have two in my lily garden outside, that I came upon last year. One was a baby who was part of a clutch that was hatched in a nest in the little garden shed outside. And while there's an open window, the little baby just couldn't fly as they can't for the first. They fledge, but they can't actually fly yet. So they kind of run around on the ground looking for food, and the parents keep watch on them. But there wasn't the proper food in the garden shed for this little guy, so he expired. And then there was another one I found, who might have been from the prior year, who I uncovered in the driveway at the same time. So I put them together in our lily garden. But they're a small little bird, and they've got this amazing life. They're very common around here. They have a dark hood when they're mature. The babies are a little bit nondescript. They're kind of tan and white and stripy, and they, as I said, they spend their time moving around by foot with short little flights, tiny little flights at 6 or 8 feet at a time over those first few days after they've fledged, until they are big enough and strong enough to be able to fly. And so the parents keep watch. And over the years, there have been both tragedies and losses with the juncos, but also beautiful surprises. And so I've been recording some of these things. This year, I even began recording things on my calendar, my electronic calendar. Oh, this is the first day I'm seeing the swallows come back for the season. The violet green swallows who make nests in the eaves around this 2-story cottage, wood cottage that we live in. And there are these perfect little places underneath where the eaves, the roof comes down, and there's a little opening. Maybe it's ventilation or something up there. And so there are just nests that swallows' nests that form up there, and we get to hear the chirping and the noises and see the nest and the droppings from the swallows everywhere around. But I've been recording these things fastidiously for years and years, not in a methodical way, not in a way that anybody, myself or anybody, would be able to look back and say, oh, on May, whatever day of 2013, there was a junco in a certain place where I lived, and here's what was happening. But there's a lot of recordings like that sporadically over time. And so while I haven't been a methodic nature journaler, I've definitely been engaging, watching, and learning things. And so nature journals also include questions and inquiries, commentary on what we see. They can even include memories of things that come up for us when we're engaged with the natural world. So I might, see something out my window, or when I'm hiking, experience something, or see the way the light comes down and hits the fiddlehead on the unfurled end of the fern at the beginning of the spring season. And it reminds me of a field trip I took years ago and tasted my first fiddlehead and how delicious it was. I never knew you could eat a fiddlehead until that time, in the mid 1990s, and somebody pulled a fiddlehead right off of the plant and handed it to me, and it tasted so nutty, like any other kind of nut that you might encounter. And so those kinds of things can come up for us when we're engaged in the natural world. But the two main things for me are really taking time to observe what's happening out there, and then taking time to record that. Is sometimes that looks like actually having a journal with me outside, or often it's my phone. We've had some cougar roaming around in recent months, which I've talked about in some of these webinars, and so I wasn't very keen on going out on my own for a period of time because the cougars were doing some damage, and attacking livestock and things like that. But I do carry my phone with me just on the off chance something might happen, but also because it's great to have a camera available at a moment in case I see something out in the natural world. But I've also taken now to sometimes doing some voice memos that I can then transcribe and put into journals, or taking photos of something that later I might paint, because I'm not carrying my paint supplies or my drawing supplies with me often when I'm out in nature, though most or many nature journaling people do, particularly artists who are really adept at creating in the field. And so there are stages and ways that we can do this, and the journaling part itself, the actual capturing of the information in maybe a nice book or a sketchbook, does not have to take place in the moment. It does not have to take place in the field. But often I find that my quick notes do need to happen when I'm out there, because otherwise I will forget. The most magnificent thing can happen and I'll be fully immersed. And then the next amazing thing happens and I forget the first one. So I try to take notes as I go along, if I think that I'm going to be incorporating those experiences into a nature journal. Also, I think finding things for years and years and years and years. Well, actually, since I was a little girl, I will admit it, I've been collecting things from the natural world and doing things with what I collect. And so sometimes it's a beautiful leaf that I flatten and press in a very formal way, maybe actually in a flower press. Sometimes it's underneath a book, a stack of heavy books, in between some scratch paper, some extra paper. And then I might actually put that inside the journal. Often I don't paste it. I really love the surprise of putting it in, not fixed to the page. So when I open the journal, these things start falling out. I love that. I think that's so fun. So feathers, leaves, that sort of thing. Sometimes flowers that I press. And really, I don't do any of that in a systematic way. I've gone through periods where, kind of jags, I guess I could say, where I've done paper making, handmade paper, which is a little bit of an involved process. And I wanted to incorporate flowers, and I add these beautiful flowers, and I dried them all properly so they were very flat. And then when I put them in and very carefully put them into the paper mulch, when they dried, they turned brown, even though they had been preserved and dried with their original, maybe a little bit faded, but their original color, a lighter hue of that original vibrance that they had. And I at one point I thought, oh yes, note to self, I need to figure out how to, I know it's very possible to dry things and have them maintain their color, and it's done in a particular way. And I made a note to myself, 30 years ago, to figure out what that process was and to actually do it. And then I didn't, because I was busy doing other things, right? And 30 years now have gone by and I'm still not quite sure how to dry my flowers. So a lot of what I do with the nature journaling is accident or serendipity, or just sort of, let's see what happens with these nature objects over time. And because I use nature objects and other kinds of creations that I make, not just nature journaling, I've been able to see kind of what holds up over time. I saw some, recently I discovered this season, actually, the beginning or middle of springtime, these dandelions, and I could see the dandelions growing from the other side of my deck in a far part of the yard. So I knew they must be very large. And of course they stood out, the yellow against the green. And so I walked over to just see quite exactly how large these were. And I knew that the lawn was going to be mowed shortly. So I was going to need to collect these. If I was going to look at them, I needed to do this before the lawnmower went over the top of them and took their heads off. And so I went over and I realized they were Siamese dandelions. It was the yellow flower, and it was one big fat stem, about almost an inch wide from left to right, and about a quarter inch deep. And it was very flat. It was very kind of rectangular rather than a round stem. And I was so struck by this. Wow, Siamese dandelions. And there were two pairs of twins growing right near each other, and I scoured the yard before the mower for other Siamese dandelions, and there weren't any. Um, and so I was really struck by these identical twins that had grown up. I'd never seen this before and wondered about that. And so I took those and I brought them in. I took some photos and sent the photos off to some family members saying, whoa, look at this, they're twins. Wow, have you ever seen this before? And I had them just sitting on my windowsill here. And I didn't put water in because I just was going to let them dry and see what happened. And if they dried okay, maybe I'd put them in a nature journal or in some other project I do with nature objects. And all of a sudden, I looked a few days later, and maybe it happened right before the weekend, so I wasn't at my desk as much that weekend. I came back after the weekend, and the dandelions that had been yellow flowers were now the white puffy spores. And they had done that all by themselves. I didn't know that they would do that when they weren't still out in the grass. And I just got such a kick out of that. It's like they had grown a little crew cut or something, just this fuzzy head of white reproductive parts. And so those kinds of things I find so interesting. And I kind of, learning about objects and learning about the natural world by seeing what unfolds, even when they're no longer out in their natural environments. This also happened with, I should have grabbed them to bring to the computer before we started today, but I have some huge seed pods that are part of a tree that's not native to this area. It's called a paulownia with these beautiful lavender flowers, which are now done for the season. They only bloom for a very short time. And they have these incredible pods that are quite robust. And also the bloom is pretty tall and big. And so when I was out collecting, as I do every year, some of the lavender colored flowers to do some kind of project outside with them, I saw these seed pods and I thought, oh yeah, I'll bring those inside. I know what I can do with that. And so I had them, it was kind of a wet day. It was a little bit damp. So I had the seed pods drying someplace across the room here, across my office. And then a few days later, I noticed something white underneath where they were sitting, and apparently some little seed pieces inside the pod had dried and fallen out. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So these experiences, these tiny little experiences, as the natural world does what it does, even in a state of decay or after it's connected and still living out in its natural environment, are all fodder for nature journaling. And for me, it's often, what question am I going to explore? And where am I going to go to get the information? Because I don't hardly, use a card catalog anymore in the library. There are so many other sources of information, and I have field guides. And of course, we have so many online resources and agencies and organizations that specialize in certain kinds of things. So I would encourage anybody, either of you, or always encouraging myself and others around me, to follow the exploration that has juice for you, right? And so while all of these things that I've written about over years are not particularly methodical, I have done research, right, in my grad school years, and I know how to do that. But I just love the magic and the spontaneity of seeing something happen, perhaps something I don't even expect, like the little white seeds out of the paulownia or the dandelion things that were happening a few weeks ago, and allowing those to feed my curiosity and to allow those things to lead me to the next step of learning and the next step of, taking things down in a journal. So nature journaling can take a lot of forms. I've seen some beautiful, beautiful nature journals in recent months, especially as I engaged with my sister in a nature journaling class online. I think last fall we started, and we're still meeting weekly and trying our hand at painting and drawing things. sketching, and I never want I mean, I always let me back up. I learned about a woman some years ago. I learned about a woman when she turned 50. She just became this amazing nature journaling person. She started painting and she started writing what was happening in the natural world. And she'd had some things in her life that was the turning point. And so then she had the freedom to just kind of create this, I'm going to say career, though it wasn't for money making or to survive. It was just this occupation that she took on, and she loved it and she was passionate about it. And at the time I heard about that, I was in my 30s, and I thought, okay, I've got until I'm 50. That's like the last moment I can actually start to do my nature journaling. And of course then 50 came and went, and I still wasn't doing what I thought was nature journaling, which is, beautiful images drawn with maybe some beautiful watercolor wash and some notes about what it is and when I saw it and what was happening and where I was, all of those details, right, that we think about in recording the natural world. But recently, I've tried my hand so at various things, and I definitely see where my weaknesses are and where I need some training. But I also realized that because we learned some tools in a recent nature journaling course that I took, that actually there are ways to capture images of things that don't require being a fine artist, they don't require being trained, and they don't require, frankly, a whole lot of skill. That just, one technique we were taught is to make short strokes instead of trying to draw a complete circle in one whole single line motion. What if you just kind of make these tiny strokes? And so what you come out with is not a circle that looks like it was printed on in some perfect way, but it's actually this drawn image that to me looks a little more earthy and a little more like the natural world, a little more imperfect. So I've been really experimenting with that with my sister, and having a lot of fun sort of seeing, oh, that there are ways to record, there are ways to, make little lines or boxes inside the pages of a journal and to put dates or names of something, or gosh, I don't know what this is. I'll call it the beautiful magenta flower because I don't know what it's called. And to just begin to look at form, sometimes function, depending on if I'm out in the natural world looking at it, or if I'm just trying to capture in a drawing what I see in a photo I've taken. So there's so many ways to do nature journaling. I have spent a fair amount of time with people who are artists who use the natural world as inspiration and subject for their creative endeavors. And sometimes that's using natural materials in their crafts work or their artisan work. Sometimes it's painting the natural world around them, or stitching even flora and fauna from the local area into various fabric art pieces. But that's not that is a kind of capturing, but the nature journaling, I think, asks us to really use the book as our form, the pages of a book, and to add to those pages. And if a person finds rocks or other big fat chunky things that don't fit in the leaves of a sketchbook, I have seen and done myself little projects on the outside of the sketchbook with, glue guns are great for this. Just a big wad of hot glue and sticking the rock on the outside, or whatever, the big chunky thing on the outside of the journal. So there are infinite ways. Also, I've made bookmarks and in a fixed, whatever the object is, tied it to the end of the bookmark. And so what goes through and lies inside the book is flat, and the sketchbook or the journal will close. But then the very fat or heavy object is actually hanging down below the nature journal. And so there are just infinite ways to do this. What else do I want to tell you? Yeah, so I think in short, what I've learned is that nature journals are basically anything naturey. And it's really defined by what the person who is creating the nature journal wants to do. And so I hope that for anybody who is listening to this webinar, watching this webinar later, or for you too, or as a reminder for myself, to remember there aren't limits and to not allow the limitlessness of nature journaling to be overwhelming because there's no way to sort of structure it on the page, but to allow that to be a place of freedom. um, and I really think we can't go wrong if we follow our instincts and our interests and our curiosities in a moment. um, so what have I learned? I've learned that a person does not have to be a skilled artist, a trained artist, or an ecologist or a biologist in order to do nature journaling, or to keep a nature journal. I've learned that nature's beings and cycles and rhythms and changes and details, etc., are central to the nature journal. So looking at something and noticing a change from last year, oh, there's more of something or a different sound, or this happened this year, 2 weeks before when it did last year. Those kinds of things are important to note in a nature journal. And it also helps us see sort of our longevity. I mean, for me to notice that the junco nest that was built in a funny place on a shelf, an outdoor shelf just above eye level this year, very convenient for a spying person like me to take photos of the little nestlings. Is it all that whole process began 2 weeks before this year than it did last year. And so I can look at that, I can note that information and then say, oh, right, so I was paying attention a year ago. Okay, that's good. So I can see that I have this pattern. This is a particular bird I notice that I now am beginning to seek out. And I notice how my relationship to the natural world changes over time. And so I become more aware of things in a different way than I might have the year before. And that those little tiny pieces of I want to say knowledge, it's not always in that cognitive academic sense. I mean, we just feel that something is different sometime, or wait, I didn't record this, but I'm pretty sure we're having a cooler springtime this year than we did last year, kind of overall. Those things are also really fair game for the nature journal and remind us how we are paying attention. um, and also, I think anything goes in nature journal. This is something else I've learned. Anything goes. Poetry, really bad poetry, um, prose, stories, memories, all of the visual representations that I've talked a lot about today, anecdotes, memories, all of that, memories and reverie. I think reverie is really an important component of nature journaling. And it might be the reverie from only this morning when I was out on the deck in my bare feet, feeling how it was a warmer day than yesterday at the same time, but also how cool the breeze was when it would waft across my skin. So here are some takeaways. We write or create in our nature journal regardless of our expertise. We can learn volumes about the natural world, our immediate environment, and even our inner landscapes through observing or experiencing nature and then capturing that somehow in a nature journal. And we become more curious by being curious in the first place. And I think that's really important to note because I've seen this with other people. This isn't just my experience, though I do guide people through the natural world in my professional work, and I have them try to capture that experience in some way, not like a nature journal in an ongoing way, but really, oh, I took this walk and here's what I was thinking about as I went out on this walk. Here's what I noticed in the outer landscape, and then coming back and writing a story about that and seeing some deeper insights about themselves or their current life or their current predicament through the lens of that nature story that they had just experienced. Yeah, so I want to talk about materials. I want to talk about both of your experiences in nature. So I'm going to turn off the recording and open up the discussion for us